Welcome! If you're here for the breakdown of The Silent City, The Fractured Architect, Episode 6, and since I publish new content every 2 to 3 days, you absolutely need to tap the subscribe button and the bell icon right now. That way, you won't miss a single video in our sequence. Ready? Let's get into it. As the towering silhouette in the red fog shifted its weight with a slow, seismic grace, Lina instinctively stepped back, feeling the smooth reconfigured floor respond beneath her boots like a living membrane, its surface flexing ever so slightly as though aware of her rising fear, and the air around her thickened with a gravitational pull that wasn't physical but cognitive, as if the entity's awareness tried to reel her in by pressing faint echoes of its thoughts against the outer shell of her mind, and she clenched her jaw to resist the insinuation even as the whispering presence inside her, once subtle, now uncomfortably alert, murmured that this wasn't merely a creature but a construct capable of manipulating spatial systems at a scale far beyond human capability. A hybrid of machinery and something older that had been waiting for a compatible consciousness to reconnect its dormant architecture. And as the fog around the Colossus thinned for a moment, she glimpsed the shifting mosaic of symbols etched across its massive form, intricate patterns that pulsed with a deep red luminescence like circuitry carved into bone. And she recognized fragments of the same glyphs she had seen in her earlier vision of the disassembled crystalline core, though now they spiraled across a framework that towered more than 10 meters tall. A silent monolith breathing slow clouds of crimson vapor as if exhaling centuries of captivity, and when its head, or what resembled a head, tilted toward her, the soundless movement sent a pressure wave through the chamber that rattled her ribs, and she sensed with startling certainty that it was studying her, the way a machine studies input data before initializing a dormant command set, scanning her, evaluating her, comparing her to a profile encoded across unimaginable time. And she whispered under her breath that she wasn't what it thought she was, even as the voice inside her countered that she was exactly that she was the only remaining viable conduit for whatever sequence the chamber was preparing to initiate. And as the tides of red light intensified around the Colossus, she felt a harmonic vibration shiver through the floor, rising like a pulsed signal beneath her feet, and suddenly the entire chamber trembled as massive concentric rings carved into the walls began rotating with deep metallic groans, aligning one by one with the aperture behind her before sealing shut completely, trapping her in total isolation with the entity as the fog churned into new shapes that resembled fractured geometric spirals, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw dozens of dark humanoid forms flicker within the fog, silhouettes with no features, each dissolving into nothingness before she could focus, as if the chamber were showing her echoes of previous attempts, failed iterations of what she was now being asked, forced, to complete. And the realization that others had stood where she stood but had not survived, sent a cold spike of dread through her spine. But before she could dwell on it, the Colossus extended one immense limb, its arm unfolding like a segmented column of metal and stone until its shadow consumed her entirely. And though she could not make out a face, its presence pressed against her consciousness like a tidal weight, its awareness now merging with the entity inside her, which cried out in shock as though it had not anticipated this direct contact. And Lina felt a violent internal jolt as though two frequencies were colliding within her skull, and she staggered forward with a hoarse gasp as a blinding red pulse rippled through the chamber, freezing her in place as every symbol on the Colossus ignited with simultaneous brilliance. And for an instant she saw a vision not of destruction but of impossible architecture stretching far beyond the station, massive lattice structures floating in a void, interlinked by luminous arteries of energy that pulsed in perfect rhythm, forming something like a vascular system for an intelligence spread across starless darkness, and she felt a terrible understanding dawn. The station wasn't a structure, it was a node, a tiny fragment of a greater living network cut off from its source. And she was being chosen as the ignition key to re-establish the connection, whether she wanted to or not. And as the Colossus stepped forward with thunderous weight, the floor around her receded, lowering her toward a circular depression at the center of the chamber where a cluster of crystalline filaments rose like translucent roots reaching for her, humming at a frequency that made her bones ache, and she realized she was being positioned, guided, placed into something like an activation cradle. And the voice inside her suddenly screamed for her to resist as though its own existence depended on preventing the merge. But the Colossus awareness surged forward with overwhelming force, drowning out the voice, drowning out everything. And in the final second before her feet touched the glowing filaments, she felt the air snap with electric pressure as a new shape materialized in the far end of the chamber. A second silhouette emerging from the fog, smaller than the Colossus but unmistakably humanoid, walking with deliberate purpose toward her as the red light warped around its form, and every instinct in her body screamed that whoever or whatever it was had no right to be there, and that its arrival changed everything. The smaller humanoid silhouette emerged from the red fog with a slow, deliberate certainty that sliced through the chamber's choking tension like a scalpel, its movements unnervingly controlled, each step landing with the soundless weight of someone who either belonged in this impossible place or had learned to bend its rules, and Lina felt an involuntary shiver crawl up her spine as the entity's presence seemed to distort the air, warping the fog in thin spiraling currents that reacted as if repelled by an electromagnetic field radiating from its form. And though she strained to make out any defining features, the figure's face remained completely obscured by a shifting veil of shadow, a darkness that behaved almost like a substance of its own, sliding over its head in fluid ripples that prevented even a hint of identity from escaping. And when it lifted one arm toward her, the red light in the chamber dimmed as though recognizing or fearing whatever this newcomer embodied, forcing the towering colossus to pause mid-step as the symbols carved across its massive plates flickered erratically, stuttering between intensities like a disrupted signal struggling to remain coherent, and Lina felt the crystalline filaments beneath her feet halt their upward ascent as if awaiting a new command, which only intensified her disorientation as she realized she had been moments away from being locked into an irreversible process she barely understood, and now something, or someone, was interfering with it, bending the chamber's behavior in ways that suggested an authority rivaling or even surpassing that of the colossus, and the voice inside her surged violently, as if recognizing the silhouette with a primal terror that didn't make sense, screaming that the figure was not part of the system but something foreign, invasive, a presence that could unravel everything she had been dragged toward, and she clutched her skull as the internal resonance spiked, her vision fracturing into overlapping layers of flickering red symbols and shifting fog, and through the visual distortion she sensed a subtle exchange happening between the colossus and the smaller silhouette, not through language, but through pulses of harmonic energy, low-frequency waves vibrating through the chamber's architecture, causing the rotating rings along the walls to slow, then reverse in direction as though rewinding a sequence they had already committed to. And the silhouette stepped closer, standing no more than 5 meters away from her now, its outline becoming sharper yet its face stubbornly swallowed by darkness, and for one terrifying moment, the figure raised its head just slightly and she felt its focus land on her with the weight of a collapsing star, a pressure that crushed the breath from her lungs and held her in place with a force no physical mechanism could replicate, and the voice inside her recoiled, hissing that this was a hijacking, that the silhouette was severed from the network and carried an intention incompatible with the station's design. And Lina felt herself suspended between these conflicting awarenesses like a cable stretched to its breaking point, unable to determine which force truly threatened her, and which merely appeared to. But before she could form a thought, the silhouette extended its hand toward her with a slow, deliberate gesture that seemed to command every particle of fog in the air to freeze, and the colossus responded with a sudden seismic roar that shook the entire chamber, a bass-heavy vibration rattling Lina's teeth as the giant lurched forward, attempting to interpose itself between her and the intruder, and the symbols across its frame surged with blinding red luminescence as if preparing a defensive activation sequence, yet the silhouette did not flinch, instead subtly rotating its wrist in a motion so small Lina almost missed it. And the moment it moved, the crimson fog twisted into a tight spiral vortex around its arm, concentrating into a beam-like tendril that lashed outward in complete silence, striking the ground at the colossus' feet with a pulse of curling distortion that made the massive construct stagger backward, gouging deep trenches in the chamber floor, and Lina felt the shockwave pass through her like a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, neither hot nor cold but indescribably alien, as though a fragment of reality had been tilted sideways for a moment, and the colossus roared again, this time not in anger but in something that resembled frustration or even fear, retreating slightly as its plates reconfigured defensively, and the silhouette finally lowered its hand before turning its featureless head toward her again, stepping into the final meters that separated them, and Lina's pulse pounded as she realized that the chamber itself seemed to contract around this being, its walls shifting subtly as if recalculating structural tension in response to an unexpected variable, and the silhouette stopped directly in front of her, raising both hands with the slow ritualistic precision of someone initiating an activation she was not prepared for, and the voice inside her shrieked once more, this time not in warning, but in outright desperation, as she felt something reach into her mind, not aggressively but with the delicate precision of an operation conducted on a neural architecture far more complex than human synapses, and she staggered as flashes of memory surged up unbidden, images she didn't recognize but felt intimately tied to, impossible landscapes, fractal voids, a colossal lattice extending into forever, broken connections, an ancient wound that pulsed like a black hole. And through the flood she heard, faintly, impossibly, a voice that was not the presence inside her and not her own, whispering directly into the center of her awareness a single command: "Do not connect." And the moment the words formed, the Colossus launched itself forward with catastrophic force, the floor buckling under its mass as it charged toward them, and Lina realized too late that she was trapped between two titanic intentions, both reaching for her, both incompatible, and she had no way of knowing which would destroy her first. As the last reverberation of the collapsing corridor dissolved into an almost unreal hush, she stood completely still, feeling the trembling pulse in her fingertips as the unseen energy that had surged around her moments ago slowly thinned into a faint static haze, and with each heartbeat she sensed the lingering resonance of the presence that had whispered its warning before vanishing, leaving only the certainty that something vast and calculating was drawing nearer. The air around her vibrated with a low, sub-perceptual hum like the aftershock of a distant engine, and as she raised her head, the dim passageway ahead seemed to stretch impossibly long, as though time itself were bending to widen the distance she would need to cross. Yet the urgency inside her rose sharper, pushing her forward until her boots scraped softly across the granular floor, each step echoing too loudly in the suffocating quiet. She felt the oppressive shadow behind her. Not a creature nor a form, but an intelligence aware of her every hesitation, and with a sudden flash of intuition she understood that the environment was rearranging itself in real time, reacting to her movement the way a living organism shifts when touched, and she reached instinctively for the fractured memory shard in her pocket, its surface still warm from the last pulse of light it emitted back when the entity had tried to communicate, but now it lay in her palm inert, as though conserving its final secrets until she reached the exact threshold where they could be used. Ahead, the corridor flared into a broad chamber filled with drifting motes of amber dust and immense mechanical ribs arching upward toward a ceiling lost in shadow, and as she stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, freezing the breath in her throat while the floor vibrated in slow rhythmic pulses that matched the faint thrum she had felt earlier, giving her the distinct sensation that she was standing inside the ribcage of some slumbering colossus. Then, without warning, a sequence of lights ignited along the far wall, each one flickering violently as though struggling against an invisible interference, revealing a massive circular gate that shimmered with a distorted film of translucent energy, and radiated a subtle tonal dissonance like overlapping frequencies fighting for dominance. She moved closer, feeling the static rise across her arms as the gate reacted to her proximity, and as she reached the center of the chamber, the floor beneath her shifted so gently one might mistake it for imagination, yet she sensed it was no illusion. The structure recognized her, identified her, and accepted her presence as though she were expected. The realization unsettled her, but before she could retreat, the translucent film of energy across the gate snapped into clarity, revealing a spiraling landscape of fractal geometry and impossible architecture flickering in and out of coherence, a world made of memory rather than matter, and she felt the shard in her palm suddenly flare with heat, burning bright enough to illuminate her fingers from within. She lifted it toward the gate and the energy membrane rippled outward in concentric waves, the chamber vibrating so violently that dust cascaded from the high beams, and then a voice, not spoken, not heard, but felt, pressed into her consciousness with absolute clarity. "Do not hesitate now," it urged, its tone overlapping her own internal monologue, as though echoing from a version of herself that had lived 1,000 years ago. "You are too close to turn back." Her breath tightened as a powerful gravitational pull emanated from the gate, tugging her forward with steady, irresistible force. And although fear surged through her, she also felt an unexpected steadiness settling into her spine, a recognition that whatever awaited her on the other side was the reason every impossibility in her journey had converged. And so she braced herself, leaned into the pull, and stepped toward the shimmering threshold as the world behind her began to collapse into a whirl of disintegrating shadows and fractured echoes, leaving her no option but to move forward into the unknown convergence ahead. As she crossed the shimmering threshold, the world dissolved into a violent cyclone of fractured light and spiraling geometries that folded and unfolded around her like the turning pages of an immense cosmic mechanism, and she felt her body stretch and compress as though every atom was being inspected, catalogued, and rearranged by a presence older than any memory she had ever held. And before she could cry out, the distortion snapped into sudden, razor-sharp clarity, depositing her on a vast plateau of shifting metallic strata suspended above an abyss of swirling violet currents that pulsed like veins of an impossible organism, and she instinctively staggered forward as the ground beneath her feet rippled in concentric waves that resonated with the shard still burning in her palm. Towering monoliths rose around her like the skeletons of forgotten civilizations, each one etched with pulsating glyphs that rearranged themselves whenever she attempted to decipher them, as though guarding a language meant only for entities capable of thinking across multiple timelines simultaneously. And the air hummed with a low, oscillating frequency that deepened as she moved, coalescing into a faint chorus of overlapping whispers telling her that this place was neither a destination nor a hallucination, but a convergence point where memories were stored, the way matter accumulated in gravitational wells. She felt a pull in her chest. She felt a pull in her chest. A soft magnetic drag that guided her toward the edge of the plateau where a bridge of translucent crystalline segments extended into the luminous void, each segment igniting beneath her steps like pressure-sensitive nodes awakening after eons of dormancy. And as she ventured farther, the whispers sharpened, merging into a steady voice that resembled her own but older, heavier with knowledge she could barely comprehend, telling her she was not here to observe, but to reclaim what had been severed from her during the collapse of the first iteration. A sudden tremor shook the bridge, sending shards of light scattering outward like broken starlight, and from the abyss below rose a titanic silhouette made of interlocking shadows, its form shifting between mechanical precision and living fluidity. And despite the instinct to retreat, she held her ground as the memory shard pulsed in violent bursts that synchronized with the entity's movements, revealing that it was not an enemy but a guardian bound by the architecture of this place to confront anyone who dared cross the threshold of reclamation. The entity's presence pressed against her mind, flooding her with images of repeated failures across countless timelines, each one showing her reaching this very point only to falter, to doubt, to turn back, and the realization struck her with a cold clarity that every version of her had faced this moment, and none had succeeded in pushing beyond it. The entity lunged forward not with aggression, but with the force of inevitability, and she raised the shard above her head as it emitted a piercing harmonic that sliced through the oppressive shadows, and caused the Guardian's massive form to recoil and unravel into spiraling ribbons of dark energy that streamed upward into the endless sky. The bridge steadied, the abyss quieted, and the voice in her mind, her voice, yet not, spoke with a finality that sent a chill through her spine, telling her that nothing could be reclaimed without descending into the vault beneath the convergence where the true memory core lay dormant, untouched since the fracture that had erased the earliest iteration of her identity. With no other path visible, she continued forward until the crystalline bridge narrowed into a needle-like precipice leading toward a circular aperture floating in midair like an open eye carved from obsidian light, and as she stepped through it she felt gravity vanish, the world invert, and her thoughts scatter like sparks in a magnetic storm while she plunged downward into a chamber so massive it felt like the hollow interior of a planet-sized archive, its walls lined with millions of suspended memory capsules glowing faintly like fireflies, all of them drifting in slow orbits around a central core that pulsed with a heartbeat she recognized as her own, though magnified and distorted by ages of silence. As she drifted deeper into the colossal chamber whose sheer scale defied comprehension, the slow orbit of the countless memory capsules became a silent constellation around her, each glowing sphere carrying an echo of a life she could not yet recall. And as the gravitational pull of the central core intensified, she felt her consciousness stretch toward it like a thread being drawn into a needle's eye, compelling her to move despite the growing pressure in her chest that hinted at the immensity of what waited below. Her descent slowed as the shimmering currents of pale gold energy spiraled around her, forming translucent pathways that converged into a spiraling corridor leading directly toward the pulsating heart of the vault. And when her feet touched solid ground again, she found herself standing upon a circular platform of polished obsidian glass, etched with patterns that shifted beneath her like living circuitry, tracing the outline of a colossal spherical structure suspended in the air only a few paces ahead, a structure that beat with a deep, rhythmic pulse perfectly synchronized with her own heartbeat. Though magnified into something ancient and immense, she approached cautiously, her reflection rippling across the mirrored floor, as though resisting her presence, and the sphere responded to her proximity by peeling back layers of luminous fractal membranes that parted like the petals of a vast mechanical flower, revealing within its core a single spiraling lattice of crystalline threads that formed a blueprint of something unmistakably familiar. Her mind, or rather the earliest iteration of her mind, preserved in exquisite detail as if awaiting reactivation. A wave of vertigo washed over her as memories not her own flickered at the edges of her awareness, glimpses of a world she did not recognize, of faces blurred by time and distortion, of choices she could not remember making yet felt the consequences of with bone-deep certainty. And before she could brace herself, the lattice emitted a thin beam of silver light that pierced the shard in her hand and ignited a cascade of images so dense and overwhelming she had to steady herself against the platform, realizing with growing alarm that this place was not a vault of passive storage, but an active mechanism designed to rewrite, reassemble, or even overwrite identity depending on the intent of the one who triggered it. Her pulse quickened as the silver beam expanded into a swirling helix that wrapped around her body, suspending her weightlessly while threads of light scanned her memories one by one, evaluating them, comparing them to the lattice, and she felt as though invisible hands were turning the pages of her life, lingering on fractures she had never understood, Moments where her instincts felt older than her experiences, where her reactions hinted at knowledge she had never learned, and the realization crystallized within her that she was not meant to merely retrieve something hidden but to confront the original version of herself whose choices had once set all subsequent iterations into motion. The chamber vibrated with a deep, resonant hum as the lattice shifted and began assembling a silhouette from the swirling particles of memory, a figure that formed slowly like a ghost taking shape from dust. And though its face was obscured by the glare of the silver light, she instantly recognized the posture, the energy, the unmistakable presence of someone who was simultaneously her and not her, someone who had made decisions so severe they had required the creation of countless alternate versions to contain or repair the aftermath. The silhouette extended a hand toward her, and as the swirling helix tightened, she felt her memories merging with fragments of the older selves, creating a chaotic mosaic of overlapping timelines, and the influx of knowledge struck her like a tidal wave, showing her glimpses of the cataclysm that had fractured the earliest iteration and forced this vault into dormancy. A collapse triggered not by external forces but by a choice she had once made, a deliberate severing of a connection so potent that its rupture had rippled across realities. The platform shuddered violently as the silhouette stepped forward, its movements precise and heavy with intention, and she felt a sudden cold certainty that this moment, this confrontation with the memory of who she had once been, was the true purpose of her journey. The moment every timeline had failed to reach, the juncture where fear or doubt had always turned her back, and as the swirling helix dissolved into a storm of glittering fragments, the silhouette spoke without sound, its meaning delivered directly into her mind. To reclaim the memory would be to accept the consequences of the original choice, and to reject it would condemn every remaining iteration to collapse, leaving the vault to drift eternally in silence. Trembling with the weight of a decision she could barely comprehend, she drew a breath and stepped closer, her fingers brushing the shimmering surface of the silhouette's outstretched hand as the chamber burst into a blinding surge of silver light, and time itself seemed to hold its breath around her. As the blinding surge of silver light collapsed inward like a supernova reversing itself, she felt the chamber reconstitute around her in frantic pulses, each strobe revealing the silhouette beside her growing more defined and yet more fractured, its entire form flickering between countless versions of itself as if reality could not decide which iteration belonged in this moment. And while her hand remained locked against its shimmering surface, she felt a violent pull deep within her chest, a tether yanking her toward a memory so ancient it felt like an instinctual scar more than an event. And before she could brace herself, the vault split open into a spiraling cyclone of images, timelines, and fragmented emotions coursing through her until she no longer knew whether she was standing or falling, awake or dreaming, existing or dissolving. The silhouette moved with her through the maelstrom, its outline shedding shards of light that spiraled away like splinters of broken glass. And as the fragments ricocheted into the storm around them, each one birthed a fleeting image, herself in different realities, making different choices, dying, surviving, breaking, healing, all of them cascading together with dizzying speed until the weight of them crushed against her ribs like a collapsing star. She tried to pull away, but the silhouette tightened its grip, forcing her to witness a memory that tore itself open like a wound, a colossal structure of obsidian rising from a crimson horizon, storm clouds circling it as though drawn by an ancient gravitational dread, and at its center she saw herself, an earlier version, the original one, standing before a pulsing mechanism that radiated unbearable power, her posture rigid with grim determination as she reached for a lever forged from luminous crystal veins that crackled with unstable energy. The moment froze, then rearranged itself, showing the consequences of that single action radiating outward in catastrophic waves, the shattering of a dimension, the unraveling of identities, the creation of countless parallel selves meant to contain the fallout, each one doomed to carry fragments of the original decision without ever understanding its origin. She staggered under the realization that she had not been a victim of a cosmic accident but the architect of her own fracturing, the one who created the very labyrinth she had spent countless cycles trying to escape. And the truth slammed into her with such force that the storm around them quaked, sending arcs of silver lightning through the churning memories. The silhouette stepped closer, its form now splitting into multiple overlapping outlines as if each iteration wanted to speak at once, and though no sound emerged, she felt the message surge through her mind like an electrical current. She could not advance until she chose which part of herself she would reclaim and which she would abandon. Because the vault could not stabilize a consciousness carrying the contradictory intentions of every fractured self, breathless, she reached toward the swirling storm of fragments, feeling them brush against her fingertips like cold sparks, each one eager to be chosen yet heavy with consequence, and she realized with chilling clarity that the silhouette was not offering her a simple restoration but demanding a sacrifice, Only one version of the self could stand at the end of this convergence, and all others would be consumed as fuel for the reconstruction. The chamber lurched as structural rings unfolded from the darkness, rotating like ancient gears preparing to lock into a new configuration. And she sensed that the vault was poised on the brink of reconfiguration, waiting for her decision to determine not only her identity, but the shape of the timeline itself. Trembling, she lifted her hand toward the brightest fragment in the storm, feeling it pulse with a resonance that mirrored her heartbeat. But before she could grasp it, the silhouette surged forward, splitting into thousands of shimmering outlines that wrapped around her like a cocoon of refracted light, engulfing her in a tidal wave of memory so dense she could feel parts of herself slipping, dissolving, merging, until she could no longer distinguish where she ended and the original self began. The chamber roared with a deafening harmonic tremor as the storm converged into a single spiraling column of silver fire, swallowing her whole and hurling her into a void of disorienting silence where the next moment, whatever shape it took, would determine everything she became next. In the suffocating stillness that followed the last trembling echo of the collapsing corridor, I forced myself forward, every muscle tight with the awareness that the path ahead was no longer merely a continuation but an escalation, the air thick with metallic dust and the faint electric hum of systems awakening far beneath the structure. And as I stepped over the fractured edge of the ruined walkway, the floor gave a low groan beneath my weight, as though warning me that it too was now a fragile artifact of a past that had stopped obeying its own rules. Yet I pushed on because the vision I had glimpsed, almost unintentional, like a stray thought forced into my mind, showed the chamber ahead igniting with a pale, pulsing lattice of light shaped like a vast cage and something inside it moving slowly enough to unsettle the very rhythm of time around it. And as I advanced through the warped archway, the temperature dropped abruptly, my breath condensing as if I had stepped into a forgotten vault carved into the bones of the world, while the distant rumble of shifting machinery resonated like a heartbeat too large to belong to anything natural. And I felt an inexplicable tug at the edge of my consciousness, a pulling sensation that made my vision bend slightly, making the floor ripple as though half liquid until I blinked and steadied myself by brushing my glove along the wall, feeling it vibrate faintly as though millions of tiny mechanisms crawled within its structure. And when I reached the balcony overlooking the chamber, I saw the entity, no, the configuration, slowly rotating within the lattice of pale lines, its outline refusing to stabilize, flickering between geometric precision and unsettling organic motion. And the moment my presence registered with it, the lattice dimmed, sinking in brightness as if inhaling, and an immense pressure pressed into my skull. Not painful but heavy, like a colossal thought attempting to compress itself into my mind, and fragments of unintelligible shapes, memories not my own, and distant landscapes flooded through me before receding abruptly, leaving behind a low burning pulse at the back of my head. And I realized the entity was either communicating or probing, not hostile, but deeply cautious. And when the balcony trembled under a sudden wave of energy, a cascade of dust drifting into the void below, I staggered back only to see a secondary walkway unfolding from the far side of the chamber, each segment sliding into place with an ancient elegance that contrasted the harsh utilitarian design of the surrounding architecture, inviting me, or testing me, or both. And as I descended to it, I sensed movement behind me, a whisper of displaced air, but when I spun around, all I saw was a distortion drifting across the shadowed archway like a heat shimmer despite the cold, and for a heartbeat I felt watched by something that had no physical presence. And then the walkway lit beneath my steps, each panel activating with a soft glow, guiding me closer to the shifting silhouette within the pale lattice until the pressure returned, sharper this time, forming crude impressions in my mind, an intersection, a divergence, a choice that had already begun to narrow. Yet before I could parse any of it, the chamber shook violently, alarms erupting in deep resonant tones as a fracture tore across the ceiling, and a torrent of debris cascaded downward, some vaporizing instantly when they touched the lattice, others crashing into the walkways, forcing me to sprint toward the central platform while the entire chamber tilted with a grinding roar. And as I leapt the last collapsing panel, the entity surged with renewed brightness, drawing the falling debris away from me in a spiraling arc, shielding me just long enough for the central platform to partially stabilize, and its lattice now rhythmically expanding and contracting like a massive luminescent lung. The entity pulsed once with startling intensity, driving a single coherent thought into my consciousness: before it breaks, you must see. Before the chamber split open beneath us and the platform plunged downward into a blinding abyss of shifting white light. As the platform plunged into the blinding abyss of shifting white light, the sensation of falling dissolved into something far stranger, a weightless suspension that made it impossible to tell whether I was descending, floating, or being stretched across some unseen dimension. And my outstretched hands, reaching for balance, appeared elongated and distorted like reflections on a trembling surface, while the roar of collapsing stone above faded into a thick, humming silence that vibrated inside my ribs more than in my ears. And when the brightness finally thinned into a muted glow, I found myself standing, though I had no memory of landing, on a smooth, mirror-like plane that extended endlessly in all directions, reflecting a sky of swirling monochrome clouds that churned like slow, sentient smoke. And in the center of that impossible expanse hovered the entity's luminous lattice, no longer caged, but expanded into a vast breathing geometry that folded and unfolded like a colossal mechanical iris, each movement sending ripples across the reflective ground as though meaning itself were washing outward from its core. And as I approached, drawn by a compulsion I could neither resist nor fully understand, the pressure in my mind grew sharper, shaping itself into impressions that were still not words but closer now, like sketches of ideas forming mid-air, flashes of places that resembled the world I knew but warped by forces I couldn't name, cities swallowed by spiraling auroras, oceans rising in impossible vertical walls of water, and a sense of something ancient waking beneath all of it. And I felt a pull not just forward but inward, as if the entity were peeling back layers of my own memories to find some hidden resonance. And when I stepped closer, the luminous structure contracted rapidly, folding into a sphere the size of my torso before detonating outward in a silent burst of brilliant lines that wrapped around me like roots of light, lifting me abruptly off the reflective surface as the lines tightened, not painfully but with the neutrality of a mechanism performing its function. And in the next moment the world inverted, the sky becoming the floor and the floor becoming a contorted blur. And when the distortion stabilized, I stood inside an enormous hall that flickered between states, its architecture shifting from massive stone columns to metallic beams, to something organic, like the rib cage of an impossible leviathan. And standing at the far end was a silhouette, unmistakably human in shape but featureless, its entire form shrouded in trembling shadows that absorbed the faint light. And I felt instantly that this figure, though not the entity itself, was connected to it, perhaps a projection, perhaps a memory. And when it raised its hand, the hall shook violently, the columns bending as if made of heated metal, and an overwhelming wave of clarity struck me. The images the entity had forced into my mind were not warnings of the future but fragments of the past, a past so ancient and overwritten by history that it now existed only as buried echoes beneath the very fabric of the world. And the silhouette, expressionless and faceless, pointed behind me, urging me to turn even as the hall splintered with fractures of growing light. And when I finally turned, I saw a monstrous structure rising from the shifting floor, a colossal pillar of interlocking rings, each inscribed with symbols that crawled across their surfaces like living ink, and the entire construct vibrated in sync with the pulsing burn still embedded in my skull, the same pulse the entity had implanted. And I suddenly understood that the pillar was not rising, it was awakening, and the ground ruptured around it, sending jagged cracks racing toward my feet, forcing me backward until I collided with invisible resistance, as though the very air had become a barrier preventing retreat. And the silhouette stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate, and when it touched the pillar the symbols erupted in a storm of shifting patterns, forming vast spirals of light that tore open the hall ceiling, revealing a turbulent void where fragments of landscapes drifted like shattered glass. And the entity's presence surged once more, filling the space with a deep resonant hum as its lattice descended through the tear in the ceiling, now so massive it felt like a celestial body falling toward us. And as the light engulfed everything, the silhouette spoke at last, not with sound but with a direct, crystalline intrusion into my mind. You must remember what was forgotten before. What returns cannot be stopped. And the hall exploded into a vortex of swirling fragments as I was pulled upward through the rupture, spinning helplessly as the world broke apart around me. I was yanked upward through the vortex with such violent acceleration that I could no longer distinguish motion from distortion, my body twisting into elongated shadows as fragments of the collapsing hall spun around me like shards caught in a storm. And for an instant I thought I saw the faceless silhouette reaching after me, its hand stretching impossibly far before the vortex snapped shut and severed the vision, plunging me into a roaring darkness that churned like an ocean of ink. And as I tumbled through it, the entity's hum resonated inside my skull, the same pulse that had been building ever since its lattice first touched my mind, now amplified into something vast and ancient that seemed to thread itself into every nerve, pulling memories to the surface that were not my own, flashes of cyclopean cities rising from boiling seas, titanic shadows drifting above continents, and an intricate web of luminous conduits beneath the Earth's crust that pulsed like the veins of a sleeping giant. And as these visions collided with my thoughts, the darkness abruptly shattered into a cascade of jagged light, depositing me onto a rough stone surface where I skidded violently before coming to rest at the edge of a high precipice, gasping as I struggled to reorient myself in the dizzying environment around me. A colossal canyon stretching into the distance under a sky split by vertical streaks of white fire that drifted like torn banners of lightning frozen in time. And at the center of the canyon floor pulsed an immense circular structure half buried in dust, its rings rotating slowly despite no visible mechanism, each ring inscribed with the same shifting symbols I had seen on the awakening pillar, symbols that crawled like living script across the metal surface as though aware of my presence, and the pulse in my skull synced with their rotation, beating like a second heart that was no longer entirely mine. And when I pushed myself to my feet, the ground trembled, not with the violence of an earthquake but with a deep rhythmic vibration that felt like breathing, as if the canyon itself were alive and exhaling dust in slow, deliberate intervals. And far below I noticed dark shapes moving around the structure, countless figures wandering aimlessly, their forms human but blurred, indistinct, as if they existed halfway between matter and memory. And the chill that washed over me deepened when I realized their movements matched the pulse, each step synchronized with the throbbing rhythm, as though they were being guided by the same force that now gnawed at my consciousness. And before I could retreat, a surge of heat ignited at the base of my spine, coursing up through my ribs in a burning wave that forced me to my knees, and the visions returned, not separate flashes now but a continuous stream, a narrative unraveling itself inside me, revealing that the entity was not a single being but a fractured remnant of an ancient collective intelligence that once spanned continents, a network whose collapse had torn holes in reality that were sealed only temporarily, and the rings in the canyon were part of the original stabilizing architecture built to contain the aftermath, and something buried beneath that structure was now stirring, draining the remaining energy that had kept it dormant. And suddenly the canyon floor cracked open along a massive fault line, sending streams of dust spiraling upward as the wandering figures froze, all heads turning toward the growing fissure in eerily perfect unison, and a low metallic groan echoed across the ravine as the rings accelerated, rotating with increasing speed until they blurred into a disk of blinding light, and the symbols on their surfaces peeled away, rising like glowing serpents that twisted into the air, forming a spiraling column that shot upward toward me, forcing me backward to the cliff edge where the stone crumbled beneath my boots, and the column of symbols split open to reveal a vast dark shape rising from the canyon's depths, its form impossible to fully perceive, a mass of interlocking shadows that folded and unfolded like wings or machinery or both. And as it ascended, the entity's hum surged into a deafening resonance that nearly shattered my thoughts, and for the first time I felt the presence behind the hum, not observing me, not reaching toward me, but recognizing me, as though my presence here completed a circuit that had been broken for millennia. And in that realization I understood the silhouette's warning too late. Remembering was not optional, it was the trigger, and now what had been forgotten was beginning to return with unstoppable momentum, rising toward me as the cliff gave way beneath my feet and I tumbled helplessly into the spiraling column of living symbols. As I plunged into the spiraling column of living symbols, the sensation was neither falling nor being carried but some impossible hybrid of the two, as if gravity itself had been rewritten to coil around my body like a serpent guiding me downward through layers of shifting light and shadow. And the moment those radiant glyphs touched my skin, they dissolved into bursts of memory, fragments of forgotten histories, broken chronologies, and impossible landscapes, flashing across my mind so quickly that I could no longer tell whether I was witnessing the past, the future, or something that had always existed outside linear time. And the deeper I sank, the more the colossal presence rising from the canyon below began to take shape, not as a single form but as a sequence of forms, each overlapping the last like translucent shells, a lattice of silhouettes that folded through one another as though assembling themselves from all the possible versions of an ancient being that had been scattered across dimensions. And within that shifting architecture pulsed a single core of darkness so dense and so absolute that it seemed to bend even the surrounding light, warping the glyphs into spirals that twisted violently the closer they drifted to it. And I felt myself pulled toward that core with a force that was neither physical nor psychic but something far older, something that recognized me not as an intruder, but as a missing fragment of a mechanism that it had been trying to complete for uncounted millennia. And as I fought the pull by sheer instinct, the canyon around me flashed back into view for a split second, rings now spinning fast enough to generate arcs of lightning that lashed upward like inverted roots tearing through the sky, the wandering silhouettes below raising their arms in unison as if welcoming the rising entity. And high above the cliff edge where I had stood moments earlier, I saw the faint outline of the faceless figure again, its hand lifted in a gesture I now understood was not a command but a warning, a desperate sign of resistance. And then everything vanished as the column contracted around me and plunged me through a membrane of cold pressure that scraped across my thoughts like metal dragged across bone, ejecting me into an immense chamber deep beneath the canyon floor where the air tasted of iron and static, and the darkness was so complete that even the fading glyphs seemed to crumble and die the moment they drifted more than a few feet away. leaving only the faint glow of the canyon's rings visible far above through a circular opening in the ceiling, and in that suffocating darkness something stirred. Not with the violent energy of the rising presence, but with a slow, deliberate movement that radiated authority, and a voice, if it could be called a voice, spoke inside my skull, each syllable formed not from sound but from collapsing memories that rearranged themselves to convey meaning, telling me that the being rising above was not awakening but escaping, breaking free of the containment architecture that this chamber had once controlled, and that its emergence would not simply tear open the canyon but unravel the thin barriers separating realities, rupturing the dormant lattice that had kept the ancient network from collapsing entirely. And the voice insisted that I had been brought here not as a prisoner but as a stabilizing element, the final anchor needed to re-engage the dormant systems that could restrain the entity. And before I could respond, the chamber rumbled as streams of dust cascaded from the ceiling, and mechanical groans reverberated through the darkness as faint patterns of glowing lines ignited across the stone floor, forming a massive circular platform beneath my feet that began to rise toward the opening. And with a jolt I realized I was being forced upward directly toward the ascending creature, as though the chamber had decided the only way to halt its escape was for me to confront it at the point where our two trajectories intersected, and panic surged through me as the platform accelerated. The canyon widening around me once more as the rings spun faster than ever, now generating spiraling cyclones of dust and lightning that converged around the towering shadow at their center, and the hum inside my mind swelled into a deafening resonance that forced my vision to fracture, splitting reality into overlapping frames like a malfunctioning film reel. And yet through the chaos, I felt the faint trace of the faceless figure's presence again, no longer distant, but near, within the storm, moving toward me with a speed that defied physics, as though it had abandoned whatever restraint had bound it until now and was preparing to intervene before the spiraling convergence between the entity and myself reached the irreversible point that had been set in motion the moment I remembered what should have stayed forgotten. That wraps up our analysis of the Fractured Architect in Episode 6, but the discussion is just beginning. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the entity Lina is facing is truly the Fractured Architect, or just a tool of the greater architecture? Drop your theories in the comments below, and let's discuss it. If you found this breakdown insightful, please smash that like button, it helps tremendously. And to continue the journey, click on Episode 7, the engine's choice showing on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next deep dive.